myself at the opening of a poem, enthralled with questions that defy clear answers. Like, why do we speak of it as spoken word, and wherein lies the poetic? Words unspoken are like thoughts without a lover, to tease and please into expressive bliss, without the tongue of some tempestuous arousal, or the lips of a whispered and abiding compulsion to be kissed as if in a dream. The stream of verbs that commingle between us, casting an array of insinuating beams, the vehicles of verses, lurching and fearsome, withholding, then careening unabashedly onto the screen. The connotations delve deep into the wasteland of the unuttered, now disrupted by the written and spoken words by which we dance with lyrics like mallets upon the drum, like mallets upon the skin. I sometimes find myself in the middle of a poem, besieged by answers that are the orphans of questions. The desire of the cadence to entice your ear. The surface of the paper to be the mistress of your eyes. The willingness of the word to be seduced by thought, and the shadow of the poet looming furtive and indecipherably large. The many reasons why we write. I never end a poem. I merely transpose the act of writing into listening, into scheming, into christening, into doubting, into searching, into swimming, into thirsting, into rising beyond surmising, into believing and then conceiving, into praying, and in such conveying how life often speaks so impalpably poetic, yet through spurious forms and ways. And so, Chattanooga, I give you blank page poetry, words and shadows. Relevance is relative.
It is separate gallery, Billie Holiday warms, and the bakelite radio stack like static compared to the movement of the voice. We lead in, they want us to, invite our hands, just this once, to listen, touch, turn, fine-tuning that gesture of the past. It is a fine notched knob that turns the dial between her lines of love and hardened tongues. We can still recall a time before radios were vetted with clocks. Things were merely heard and herded about by sound, by notes that sway back and forth in our minds, like a woman in heels at a compromise, a woman with a flower in her hair and holding another kind of bouquet at her nose, a microphone she'd toss away to someone else one day. The gallery is too loud to even try and listen now. Full, we say, full of people lingering and out and fingering for that last thought, the one they lost, the one they just had. The artist nods to Billie's day, and my hand reaches for something some have called divine. A woman out on a limb, about to learn she can fly.
substancelessness to its form. A woman sat for a long period of time with an infant. From the park bench, no great shadow was cast, but she sat far from the light, so this was not remarkable. In fact, the infant did not enjoy being near the light. The infant would quiet only when taken to the dark nursery, for example. So the woman did not leave her house as often during the day as another woman might have, though she left when she had to. But really, no matter how close to or far from light she carried the infant would cry or not cry, sleep or not, and she knew this. She watched men approach and retreat as they hurried between street lamps. Their lengths were dark beams, where they trailed with slack leashes. She found pleasure in the limberness of these thoughts, but the shadows themselves were no great phenomenon, she knew, not for a woman her age, though a woman playing the role she played, considering the infant's comforts and discomforts, its lifting and falling into and out of sleep at all hours of the day and night, so much so that at times she would anticipate an unusual want of the infant and would act. Yes, a woman like this might find the shadow as remarkable as she did, holding an infant on a bench at a late hour, unable to recognize the thing as dark and formed, but without marks.
After an absence of 7 years, I find my first love and learn that she is now a mother. And it is strange to think that she has held a life in the dark hands of her womb. No longer is she the girl smiling at the photographs perched along my bedroom wall. After an absence of 7 years, it is as if our mouths never abandoned the melody of each other's names, and I'm hearing her full, rich laugh anew. Through the course of our conversation, we both choose to keep the sweetness present. We have unconsciously agreed not to wade into our bruised history. We do not speak of that which we have both lived through together, but it is still alive and lying atop our veins. I do not have far to reach to remember the sting of the word nigger, tumbling like hail out of her father's lips toward me. I can still remember her eyes shining like soft moons in the dark as she asked me to leave her 17th birthday party so that her parents would not know that I had come to celebrate her honor. I can still remember how often I clasped my hands and prayed for God to grant me a different world to wake to, instead of the hungry South, whose pride and tradition tower like a grim juggernaut over choice. She stands before me, happy, beaming like new morning with her infant asleep in her arms. I realize that distance and time are limited wives of acceptance, and though I doubt our tongues will ever admit it, I know that we've made our peace with who we were all those years ago, when we were as vulnerable as thin ice, and only just learning of the true weight contained in our care for one another. When we both came to know that I had the heart to love her, just not the skin.
of dry debris at the bank of the creek. He sings among the bristle brush of a cut evergreen. Here, even the warbler's cries are faint. We two drift through the place that connected our childhoods on a well-creased map, a tributary of knots and clots, invasive privet bamboo, our memory of dairy cows, now a sprawling Methodist church. We lean to the side of our narrow raft, touch our open palms to the water, as if placing them in wet cement. A history, a future, a stepping stones before us. I find myself leaning towards you and begin to sketch on your back with my wet fingers the simple lines of native plants, wild ginger, May-apples, rue anemone. We begin to sense their fragrance all around. I draw an endangered white skull cap on the muscle of your arm. Lift its sleeve so it might bloom. Find whatever it still needs. It is so like me, you think, to thumb through a faded field guide, to still search for the names, to reach for what we've lost.
In rented, red plastic kayaks, the couple makes unsteady way, rocking through water churned by the outboard motors of fishing boats across the channel of the drowned river. They're headed for the lacustrine cave where the gray bats brood. Where the water is deepest, he spots a scrap of foam bobbing, a trot line. The other end, they find, when he pulls it up, is knotted to a hook sunk into the eye of a catfish. He tells his partner to hold it, so she holds it. In his mercy, he twists the hook around, searching for the angle that will free it. When the socket starts to pop from the pressure, she says she can feel it in her hands. The skin tears clear to the edge of the lip. The fish barks, gasping in harsh air. The hook holds. She turns her head away. When he twists the hook and the jaw snaps, she says she won't hold anymore. But she doesn't let go. Watching for the first time, they can't decide what the problem is. Faulty echolocation, drowsiness. But every so often, emerging from the cave mouth to feed on twilight bugs, two bats slap against each other, dip briefly, then regain course with a flutter that looks almost like dancing. He admires the way their flight paths otherwise trace the air currents, charting in a river of flesh the network of weather crossing the mountain. Unimpressed by their number, she sighs. She had expected them to blacken the sky. In the truck on the way back, he looks over at her. She smiles, unaware of his gaze, unaware she is smiling. The radio begins a new song. They both hear strains of old songs in it. though the songs they remember are different. The hull of the ferry crossing the strait. A survivor in the solarium atop the sinking ship studies the pod of orca surrounding him. The faces of the rescuers open like night flowers when they find him, lest the harm they expected. Someone made a movie about it called Cliffs Above, a documentary of the shepherd girl who spotted the wreck from the spit of rock where for centuries her family has scraped by, shearing sheep and steering them clear of the sheer cliffs, alone and apart. She has never seen a camera. When she asks, the director tells her the camera is a machine incapable of forgetting. He tells her it is an eye precisely designed to capture the passage of time. In the next scene, the shepherd walks behind the flock, saying, "Salute, little friends." She is a kind one, keeps them shorn in summer. Darkness coming on, the shepherd girl's mother watches at the window for the sheep to climb down the steeps, bleeding in the heat and trailing her daughter behind. Each moment of movement is contained by a black frame. The eye thinks through the gaps between, arranges them out. No one notices the seams in the seeing. Everything stays put, but the mother's rough, seamed hands wringing each other. But her daughter is not coming home. Not yet. She has met her lover at the cliffs. Under a bare tree, she confides to him that her father, having watched the flock harried by a year-long drought dwindle to carpeted bags of bones, chose for them all, drove them to the edge of the cliff and over. She grabs her lover by the wrists. He was a kind man, she insists. What he did was, if you average it out, kind of love.
Sometimes I find myself in the
No matter what she girls smiling in the progress, touching the ball like after absent 7 years, it is in our mouths. Never abandon the melody of each other's names.
I never end the poem. Rapture,
And I'm hearing her full,
listening and Christian,
laugh,
searching and thirsty eye thinks through the gaps.
Through the course of our conversation, we both choose to keep the sweetness present.
I find myself in the middle of a dream.
She watched men go down the street and hurry.
We do not speak of what we have both been through together.
Some
May
of
it
it
still
will be
provide, lying atop our veins.
Sometimes I wonder.
I do not know how to reach to remember the sting.
No great shadows.
Sometimes I don't.
It was a kind of
Always.
love.
Before the ending, there was the beginning.
Their legs were dark beams, so they trailed like soft
I can still remember her eyes,
Loud,
shining softly
light,
through the
disintegrated itself.
as she asked me to leave her 17th birthday party,
I sometimes find myself in the middle of a dream.
so that her parents would not know that I had come to celebrate her honor.
A woman her age.
Each moment of movement was contained
Well,
by that flat drum.
Really hard and warm.
Drum.
Like melanin on the skin.
I can still remember how often I clasped my hands and prayed for God to grant me a different
She
world
took
to wake
pleasure in
to.
limbering.
Wild ginger.
Instead of
Faces
the
of the
South,
rescuers open like night flowers.
whose pride and tradition towered like a green juggernaut over choice.
But really, no matter how close you or far your life
I never end the poem.
As she stands before me, happy, breathing like the morning of her
Every
infancy.
so often,